They whispered it in hushed tones across Europe. A mother who wed her own son, not for love, but to save a fortune that threatened to slip away. A scandal so extraordinary, it shook courts, rewrote laws, and left a legacy of shame that outlived them all. Before we step into that world of whispers, power, and betrayal, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments below. Now, let us begin. In the late autumn of 1885, whispers spread through the narrow streets of Bordeaux. The air was damp, the stones slick with recent rain, and yet even the cold could not keep the townsfolk from gathering at corners, leaning toward one another, exchanging fragments of a tale that seemed at once scandalous and sorrowful. At the center of the murmurs stood a woman of commanding presence, Madame de la Barre, widow of one of the wealthiest merchants the city had ever known. Her husband, Auguste de la Barre, had left behind not only a vast fortune, but also a tangle of obligations and suspicions. 4 decades, he had presided over trade routes that carried Bordeaux wines as far as London and Amsterdam. He had invested in shipping ventures, dabbled in colonial trade, and accumulated property across the region. When his sudden death left all of it in the hands of his widow, the city watched closely, waiting for either her triumph or her ruin. Madame de la Barre, however, was no fragile widow. Tall, dark-haired, with eyes that did not easily yield their secrets, she commanded both respect and wariness. Some said she had been the true mind behind her husband's dealings, that her careful hand had guided every investment. Others whispered she had grown merciless in her pursuit of wealth, willing to silence rivals with threats or schemes. The will was clear. The estate would pass to her son, Henri, once he reached his full majority. Henri, then 23, had neither his mother's steel nor his father's ambition. He was delicate of frame, with a thoughtful, almost melancholic air. His interests leaned toward poetry, music, and long walks by the river, rather than the counting house or the courtrooms where fortunes were defended. But beneath the surface of the de la Barre household lay a danger more pressing than idle gossip. The family's wealth, though vast, was under siege. Auguste de la Barre had borrowed heavily against his lands, and the creditors, long kept at bay by his reputation, now circled with growing impatience. To preserve what remained, the fortune needed to be consolidated, titles secured, and inheritance disputes extinguished before they could ignite. It was here that Madame de la Barre conceived of the plan that would one day scandalize Bordeaux and echo far beyond its borders. She studied the codes of inheritance, the intricacies of French property law, the loopholes through which wealth could slip from one branch of a family into another. She saw, with unflinching clarity, that should her son marry outside the family, the estate could fracture. Rivals, cousins, uncles, opportunistic creditors, would seize the chance to contest his claims. And so, in the privacy of her chambers, by lamplight that flickered against heavy velvet curtains, she resolved upon a course that would astonish even the boldest of her peers. She would bind the fortune, the estate, and the family name in the closest bond imaginable. She would marry her son, Henri. Henri, when first confronted with the idea, was horrified. He had always respected his mother, admired her strength, even feared her when her temper flared, but the suggestion seemed at once unnatural and impossible. Yet she pressed upon him with reasoning as relentless as the tide. If he married another, the estate might dissolve. If he married no one, the creditors might take all. Only by uniting with her could the family shield itself from ruin. The nights grew longer, and the arguments sharper. Madame de la Barre evoked duty, legacy, and the ghosts of their ancestors who had sacrificed so much to build the family's name. Henri spoke of honor, of appearances, of conscience. But he was young, and she was determined. In the end, her will prevailed. The decision was sealed not with ceremony, but with silence, as though by not speaking of it too loudly, they could both keep the world from hearing. And yet the world always hears. The first hints of what had been done emerged when legal papers were filed, papers that bore both their names, binding their estates as one. The clerk who recorded them could scarcely contain his astonishment. Within days, rumors spread. Some dismissed them as absurd, the wild inventions of jealous rivals. Others swore they had seen documents with their own eyes. By the winter of 1885, the tale had become too large for whispers alone. It began to appear in pamphlets, in scandal sheets, even in the letters of visiting Englishmen who found in the story the perfect mixture of decadence and intrigue. And all the while, within the shuttered mansion of the de la Barres, mother and son lived under the weight of a union both strategic and damning. For Henri, each morning was a torment of conscience. For his mother, each morning was another step in her relentless march to preserve what she believed was rightfully theirs. The city, meanwhile, watched with fascination, and prepared itself for the storm that was certain to come. By the spring of 1886, the de la Barre household had become a fortress against the eyes of Bordeaux. The tall wrought-iron gates, once open to welcome merchants, politicians, and distant relatives, now remained shut. Curtains rarely parted. Deliveries were made swiftly, with servants instructed to avoid conversation in the marketplace. Yet secrecy only sharpened curiosity. The matter of the documents, stamped and filed in the city's legal offices, could not be erased. Clerks spoke in hushed tones, lawyers denied involvement, and judges shook their heads at the mention of it, yet copies circulated among the curious. The arrangement was unusual, shocking to some, but it carried the mark of legality. Inheritance law, labyrinthine as it was, had left a crevice wide enough for Madame de la Barre to step through, pulling her son with her. Henri bore the consequences most keenly. When he ventured into the streets, whether to buy books or simply to breathe the fresh air, he felt the stares of passers-by prick his skin. Former companions, young men who once drank wine with him by the river and spoke of poetry, now turned away. Invitations ceased. His soft, hesitant demeanor made him an easy subject for ridicule. They whispered that he had been ensnared by his mother's will, too weak to resist, a puppet in her elaborate design. Yet behind the heavy doors of their mansion, another story unfolded. Henri, in the privacy of his study, still wrote poetry, still played his violin in the evenings, the notes rising like fragile birds above the silence. His mother, meanwhile, spent long hours in the office once occupied by her husband, poring over contracts, calling upon notaries, summoning trusted men to secure the family's interests. She seemed invigorated by the struggle, as though each obstacle to the fortune's survival quickened her resolve. At the heart of her determination was a fear she never admitted aloud. Beneath her commanding exterior lay the memory of her youth, of her own family ruined by poor investments and lost property. She had vowed never to be vulnerable again. To her, the fortune was not mere wealth. It was protection, dignity, a fortress against humiliation. And if society scorned her methods, she would endure the scorn as long as her household remained intact. Not all were scandalized. Some, particularly those with much to gain from her favor, continued to visit in secret. A banker from Paris came under the cover of night, praising her shrewdness and assuring her of his discretion. A land agent arrived with documents transferring vineyards into Henry's name, remarking only that such consolidation was prudent. These men, driven by profit, cared little for whispers of impropriety, but others prepared for war. A cousin of Auguste de la Barre, a stern man named Philippe, had long coveted a share of the estate. Upon hearing of the marriage arrangement, he declared it an outrage and vowed to contest it in court. "The law is not blind," he said to his allies. "No clever wording can disguise such an abomination." With each week he gathered supporters, readying his petition. Madame de la Barre anticipated his move. She knew Philippe's ambitions, knew his debts and weaknesses, and had no intention of surrendering the fortune to him. She instructed her lawyers to prepare counterclaims, to highlight Philippe's own improprieties, and to stall proceedings whenever possible. What might have been a family dispute was fast becoming a spectacle of the entire city. Henri, caught between loyalty and shame, withdrew further into himself. He avoided the salons, ignored letters from old acquaintances, and let his mother's determination shield him. At times, he wondered whether he had betrayed his own conscience by yielding to her plan. Yet when he looked upon her, upright, unflinching, resolute, he felt the pull of duty, as though her strength commanded his obedience. The spring rains fell heavily on Bordeaux that year, washing the streets and swelling the river. But no rain could wash away the whispers. The tale of the widow who had married her son was told in cafés, repeated in taverns, and carried by travellers to Paris, where it became the subject of both ridicule and fascination. Some declared it proof of decadence in the provinces. Others admired the audacity, even while condemning it. And so the stage was set, a household fortified against scandal, a city divided between gossip and awe, and a cousin preparing to challenge them in court. The fortune was preserved, for now. But the storm had only begun. The summer of 1886 arrived, heavy with heat and anticipation. Bordeaux's streets shimmered beneath the sun, and yet the true fire of the season burned in the courtrooms, where the name de la Barre was whispered with both fascination and scorn. Philippe de la Barre, cousin to the late Auguste, had formally lodged his petition. He declared before the magistrates that the union of mother and son was an affront to natural law, to decency, and to the divine order itself. He demanded that the arrangement be nullified, the estate divided, and Henri stripped of his claims. The petition did not surprise Madame de la Barre. What surprised her was the ferocity with which Philippe pursued it. He had gathered not only his own supporters, but also allies from rival merchant families who had long envied the de la Barre's prominence. They flocked to his cause, each hoping to pry a fragment of the fortune loose. The hearings began in a stifling chamber, its windows open to let in the sluggish summer air. Crowds gathered outside, eager for a glimpse of Henri and his mother. On the first day, when the pair arrived in their carriage, the crowd pressed close. Some shouted insults, others merely stared, as though beholding figures from a scandalous tale. Henri lowered his gaze, cheeks pale, while his mother sat upright, her chin lifted, her gaze steady. Inside, Philippe thundered against them, his words echoing in the chamber. He spoke of morality, of family honor, of the unnatural corruption that had defiled the name de la Barre. But his voice, though passionate, betrayed desperation. His own debts weighed heavily, and his bid for the fortune was as much necessity as righteousness. Madame de la Barre's lawyer, a shrewd man named Maître Bouchard, countered with calm precision. He pointed to the law itself, to the loopholes and precedents, to the fact that no statute explicitly forbade the arrangement. "It may offend sensibilities," he said, "but the court is not the arbiter of sensibilities. It is the arbiter of legality." The argument stunned many. Some scoffed, others whispered, but none could deny its force. The law, in all its complexity, offered no direct prohibition. The magistrates, caught between outrage and technicality, hesitated. Henri spoke little during these proceedings. When asked, he gave short, respectful answers, his voice quiet but clear. He did not defend the marriage with conviction, neither did he repudiate it. His demeanor suggested a man trapped in a web he could neither cut nor escape. To some, this inspired pity, to others, contempt. The trial extended over weeks, each hearing drawing crowds. Pamphlets appeared in the city, retelling the proceedings with embellishment. Caricatures circulated, Henri depicted as a puppet, his mother as a spider weaving a vast web. Inside the de la Barre mansion, the atmosphere grew tense. Servants moved silently, wary of the storm that raged beyond the gates. Henri withdrew further into solitude, spending hours with his violin, the mournful notes drifting through the halls. Madame de la Barre, by contrast, seemed only to grow stronger. She received visitors, dictated letters, and strategized with Bouchard as though she relished the battle. But even she felt the strain in private. At night, when the house was quiet, she would pace her chamber, her thoughts racing. She knew the law was on her side, but she also knew that public opinion could shape the decisions of judges. If too much outrage gathered, if too many powerful men pressed against her, the court might bend. In these restless hours, she resolved upon a new tactic. If the law alone could not shield her, she would turn to influence. She began to court allies more openly, bankers, landowners, even certain politicians in Paris. Discreet letters were sent, favors promised, debts forgiven. Slowly, she gathered a shield not of law but of power. By late August, when the magistrates adjourned to deliberate, Bordeaux held its breath. Would they uphold the Union, or strike it down? Would Henri inherit all, or would Philippe succeed in his challenge? The judgment, when it came, astonished even those who thought themselves prepared. The court, with grave reluctance, declared that while the union was most unusual and contrary to the spirit of custom, it was not in direct violation of statute. The arrangement would stand. The fortune remained bound to Henri and his mother. The announcement provoked uproar. Outside the courthouse, crowds jeered. Philippe stormed from the chamber, vowing to appeal in Paris. Henri looked stricken, while Madame de la Barre's expression betrayed no triumph, only resolve. She had secured victory, but she knew it was only the beginning, for the scandal had grown too large to be confined to Bordeaux. Paris awaited, and with it, a far fiercer storm. The autumn of 1886 carried Bordeaux into a season of unrest, not of riot or rebellion, but of rumor, curiosity, and scandal that settled into every parlor and café. News of the judgment spread quickly to Paris, where the salons of the capital thrived on tales of provincial impropriety. The city that had endured the dramas of empire, monarchy, and republic now found itself enthralled by the story of a widow who had married her son to preserve a fortune. In the corridors of Parisian power, the case was discussed with tones ranging from amusement to horror. Politicians found in it a symbol of provincial excess. Lawyers debated its implications for the civil code. Pamphleteers seized upon it to sell their papers. Some framed the matter as a grotesque scandal, a corruption of morals. Others treated it as a clever exploitation of loopholes in a flawed system. One Parisian paper, Le Journal de Tribunox, printed a headline so large it stretched across the page. "The Mother Bride of Bordeaux." The words, once printed, travelled like fire. They were repeated in drawing rooms, in court corridors, and in the chambers of students who drank cheap wine and laughed at the absurdity. For Madame de la Barre, the spread of the tale was both a triumph and a curse. On the one hand, her scheme had withstood legal challenge. On the other, her name was now synonymous with scandal. She was no longer merely the widow of a wealthy merchant. She was the infamous mother bride. Henri, meanwhile, suffered far more deeply. In Bordeaux, he had borne the stares of neighbours and acquaintances. In Paris, the ridicule became sharper, crueler, and more public. Caricatures portrayed him as a child clinging to his mother's skirts, his fortune dangling like a purse from her hand. In cafés, men laughed at his name. Women whispered that he was pitiable, weak, a man unworthy of admiration. When letters arrived from Paris, addressed to their mansion, Henri often left them unopened, his hands trembling as he stared at the familiar seals of former friends or correspondents. He knew what they contained: mockery disguised as inquiry, false sympathies masking curiosity. He withdrew further into his solitude, turning to his violin, his books, and his poetry. Yet even these comforts seemed poisoned, for whenever he wrote a line or drew a bow across strings, he could hear the faint echo of laughter from the world outside. Madame de la Barre, by contrast, grew harder, more defiant. Each insult, each caricature, seemed only to steel her resolve. She told Henri that greatness was never achieved without envy, that every powerful family had endured scandal, and that history would remember not the gossip but the fortune preserved. But beneath her composure, she too was aware of the peril. Philippe had carried his cause to Paris, determined to appeal the decision. He claimed the Bordeaux magistrates had been corrupted by influence, that the judgment was a disgrace to the Republic, and that the higher courts must intervene. His appeal found sympathy among some in Paris, for while the law had not yet condemned the Union, public opinion increasingly demanded that it do so. In preparation, Madame de la Barre began to maneuver with even greater subtlety. She dispatched Maître Bouchard to Paris, laden with documents and letters of introduction. She herself wrote discreetly to men of influence, bankers who had profited from her husband's ventures, officials who had quietly benefited from her generosity, and even clerics who, though scandalized, recognized the danger of letting inheritance law be upended by public outrage. The journey of the case to Paris transformed the scandal from a provincial curiosity into a national spectacle. Newspapers sent reporters to Bordeaux to interview neighbors, servants, and anyone who might provide a glimpse into the de la Barre household. One servant, dismissed months before for carelessness, gave lurid descriptions of unnatural intimacy between mother and son, accounts that were eagerly published though impossible to verify. Another, loyal to the family, described Henri as a gentle, dutiful son who had been dragged unwillingly into his mother's schemes. Both stories circulated, each feeding the appetite of a public that seemed to crave ever more detail. Within the mansion itself, tension thickened. Servants whispered in the kitchens, afraid of being overheard, wondering whether they would soon be dismissed if the estate fell. Some sympathized with Henri, pitying his pale, sorrowful face. Others admired Madame de la Barre's indomitable will. Henry's nights grew restless. He often walked alone in the garden, long after midnight, his thin figure barely visible in the moonlight. There, among the hedges and fountains, he wrestled with thoughts he dared not speak aloud. Had he betrayed himself, his father's memory, his very soul? He sometimes considered fleeing, abandoning the mansion, the fortune, and the scandal. Yet he could not. The weight of duty, of filial obedience, of the family name, held him fast. When autumn turned to winter, Paris summoned them. The appeal had been scheduled. Madame de la Barre prepared for the journey with her usual precision, selecting documents, instructing servants, and arranging their affairs in Bordeaux as though she already foresaw a long absence. Henri, pale and subdued, packed little, carrying only his violin and a few volumes of poetry. The departure itself became an event. Crowds gathered at the station to watch them leave, jeering and mocking as the train pulled away. "Mother bride," some shouted. Others laughed and called Henri by childish names. Yet within the carriage, Madame de la Barre sat straight-backed, her eyes fixed on the horizon, while Henri gazed silently at the passing fields, his thoughts adrift. Paris awaited them, vast and unforgiving. The capital was not Bordeaux. Its judges were sterner, its press more ruthless, its public more voracious for scandal. The case of the mother and her son would no longer be a provincial matter, but a national trial, one that might reshape not only the fate of the de la Barre fortune, but also the very boundaries of French inheritance law. The journey was long, the winter air biting as they arrived in the capital. The streets teemed with noise, carriages rattling across cobblestones, vendors calling out their wares, newsboys shouting the latest headlines. And among those headlines, the scandal of Bordeaux still glowed like a flame, drawing eyes and ears wherever the name de la Barre was spoken. Their carriage rolled through the crowded boulevards, past posters pasted on walls, some mocking, some condemning, all feeding the city's hunger for spectacle. Henri shrank into his seat, but his mother remained as ever, unyielding, unbowed, and ready for battle. The trial in Paris was about to begin. The Paris courthouse, in the chill of January 1887, loomed like a fortress of stone and judgment. Its steps were crowded with onlookers, journalists, and lawyers who had come not only for justice, but for the spectacle of scandal. The case of the widow of Bordeaux and her son had become the trial of the season, drawing attention that eclipsed political debates and even the latest upheavals in the Chamber of Deputies. Madame de la Barre and Henri arrived under heavy scrutiny. Reporters jostled one another, calling out questions as their carriage drew to a halt. The sound of pens scratching notes filled the air as much as the clatter of hooves on stone. Henri, pale as ever, avoided their eyes, while his mother descended with a composure that drew murmurs of awe and derision alike. Her dark dress was severe, her veil lowered, yet her presence seemed to command even her enemies' attention. Inside, the courtroom swelled with figures of consequence. Magistrates, lawyers, society women with their fans, and men of letters eager to seize new material for their articles. At the center of it all stood Philippe de la Barre, stiff and indignant, his voice already rising before the proceedings had properly begun. He had prepared his appeal with vigor, convinced that the higher courts would be less tolerant than the magistrates of Bordeaux. The opening arguments struck like hammer blows. Philippe's counsel declared that the union between mother and son was not only indecent, but also a mockery of inheritance law, a danger to the sanctity of family, and an outrage upon the Republic itself. They painted Madame de la Barre as a schemer who had ensnared her own child to shield her wealth, likening her to a spider clutching her prey. Their words drew gasps from the gallery, nods from the indignant, and scribbles from the eager journalists. When Maître Bouchard rose to reply, the mood shifted. Calm, deliberate, he invoked not passion but precision. He reminded the court that the civil code contained no provision forbidding such a union, that the law, whatever moral discomfort it might evoke, could not be bent to suit the outrage of the moment. "We are here," he said, his voice even, "to determine law, not to pass judgment on gossip." He emphasized Henry's majority, his legal consent, and the absence of fraud in the documents filed. Throughout the speeches, Henri sat quietly, his hands folded, his eyes often lowered. He seemed less an actor in the drama than its unwilling subject, his frail figure dwarfed by the grandeur of the courtroom. Madame de la Barre, by contrast, listened intently, her gaze fixed on the speakers, her presence radiating both defiance and determination. Witnesses were called. Some spoke in support of Philippe, recounting whispered tales from Bordeaux, how the servants believed the household strange, how Henri had been seen pale and distraught, how Madame de la Barre had grown more powerful after her husband's death than seemed fitting for a widow. Others, summoned by Bouchard, testified to her business acumen, to her role in preserving the estate, and to Henry's apparent agreement with every decision. The testimony of one dismissed servant electrified the chamber. She claimed to have seen mother and son walking arm in arm in the garden by moonlight, speaking in hushed tones. She described a closeness unnatural for kin, words that rippled through the gallery like a shock. Yet under cross-examination, her bitterness toward her dismissal became evident, her story frayed, and her reliability collapsed. Despite the theatrics, the core question remained: would the court affirm legality or yield to outrage? Days passed in argument, each session reported in detail in the press. Newspapers printed engravings of the courtroom, sketches of Henry's pale face, and depictions of Madame de la Barre's unyielding posture. Letters to the editor poured in, some demanding justice, others praising her audacity. As the proceedings stretched into weeks, Henry's health seemed to wane. He grew thinner, his eyes shadowed, his hands trembling when he lifted his violin in the evenings. Yet his mother's will did not falter. She reminded him daily that their survival depended on endurance, that to yield now would mean not only the loss of the fortune, but also humiliation beyond repair. Finally, the judges withdrew to deliberate. Paris held its breath. Pamphlets speculated wildly. Some predicted annulment, others foresaw a shocking victory. When the judgment was announced, the courtroom was packed to suffocation. The presiding judge, his face stern, declared the court's decision. After lengthy consideration, it affirmed the legality of the union, citing the absence of explicit prohibition in the code. The marriage, however offensive to custom, was valid in the eyes of the law. The fortune of the de la Barres remained intact. The chamber erupted in noise, cries of outrage, gasps of astonishment, murmurs of disbelief. Philippe staggered back as though struck, his face twisted in fury. Madame de la Barre's expression remained inscrutable, but the faintest flicker of triumph lit her eyes. Henri bowed his head, as though the weight of the decision pressed more heavily than ever upon his shoulders. Outside, crowds swelled with anger. The judgment, though legal, seemed intolerable to many. Pamphlets appeared within hours, denouncing the court as corrupt, warning of the collapse of morals, declaring that France herself had been mocked. Yet others, more pragmatic, admired the cunning of the widow, praising her as a woman who had outwitted both rivals and the law itself. The fortune was secure, but the scandal was no longer provincial, no longer confined to whispers. It had become a national affair, one that entwined law, society, and morality in a knot that could not easily be untied. And in the quiet of their Paris lodging, as the city roared with debate, Henri sat by his violin and played a mournful tune, the sound of a man bound not only by law and blood, but by a fate from which there was no escape. The winter of 1887 pressed hard upon Paris, but it was not the cold that most unsettled its people. It was the verdict. The higher courts had confirmed the legality of the Delabar Union, and though the judges had couched their words in solemn restraint, insisting that the law, not morality, guided them, the effect was seismic. The boulevards and cafés filled with talk. In the salons of the wealthy, women whispered behind their fans while men shook their heads, muttering of decay and corruption. In the taverns of the working quarters, the story was repeated with coarse laughter, a tale that seemed to prove the arrogance of the rich. Even the pulpits were not silent. Priests denounced the judgment as a sin against nature, warning congregations that when family bonds were twisted for profit, society itself would rot. Pamphleteers thrived in this climate. Their presses ran late into the night, printing broadsheets with bold headlines: "A Republic of Shame," "The Spider Widow," "Henri the Puppet." Some papers took a different tone, painting Madame de la Barre as a brilliant, if ruthless, strategist, a woman who had used the law's own weapons to outmaneuver men who sought to steal what was hers. These contrasting portrayals only fed the fire. Within the lodging where mother and son now stayed on the Rue de Rivoli, the scandal echoed like distant thunder. The tall windows overlooked the busy street, but Henri rarely stood near them, fearing to meet the gaze of passers-by. He spent his days in silence, reading little, playing his violin only when the night was too heavy to bear. His health declined further. Dark rings shadowed his eyes, his cheeks hollowed. Madame de la Barre, however, refused to retreat. She received visitors discreetly, lawyers, bankers, sympathetic deputies. She understood that victory in court was not the end of the struggle. The real danger now lay in politics. The scandal had awakened voices calling for reform of the civil code, for the closing of the very loophole she had exploited. If those reforms succeeded, her victory would stand as the last of its kind, but the fury they unleashed might yet consume her family. Henri, weary of constant whispers, begged her to leave Paris, to return to Bordeaux and live quietly behind their mansion's gates. But she shook her head. "Silence is surrender," she told him, "and surrender means death, not only of the fortune, but of our name." Philippe, though defeated in the courts, did not relent. He became a figure of sympathy in Parisian circles, railing against the decision as proof that the law had been corrupted by wealth and influence. He penned letters to newspapers, gave speeches in salons, and courted alliances with politicians eager to ride the scandal for their own purposes. His figure, tall and sharp, became familiar in debates where the question of morality clashed with legality. The affair even reached the Chamber of Deputies. A deputy from Lyon, seizing the moment, stood and denounced the decision as a stain upon the Republic. He demanded a review of the inheritance code to prevent what he called unnatural unions of convenience. His speech drew cheers from some, jeers from others, but it ensured that the name de la Barre would echo in the very heart of government. Meanwhile, in the salons of Paris, the scandal became entertainment. Playwrights sketched comedies thinly veiling the story. Cartoonists filled newspapers with grotesque parodies, and poets, both serious and mocking, wove verses about the bride mother and her pale son. Henri became a symbol not of wealth but of weakness, a figure pitied by some, scorned by others, and almost never respected. The strain told upon him most cruelly. He grew withdrawn, his hands trembling whenever he was forced to appear in public. He could scarcely eat. The once gentle dreamer who had walked the banks of the Garonne now seemed a shadow of himself, a man whose soul was being eroded by mockery and shame. Yet Madame de la Barre's will did not falter. She carried herself with dignity in public, never yielding to insult, never showing fear. In private, she allowed moments of weariness, long hours of pacing her chambers, staring at documents as though they alone could anchor her. But to Henri she showed only resolve. "We endure," she told him. "That is how dynasties are made." By spring, murmurs grew that the government would indeed move to alter the law. Committees were convened, debates scheduled. The de la Barre case had become the catalyst for reform. It was no longer just a scandal. It was a matter of national policy. For Henri, the prospect brought no relief. The idea that their names would forever be attached to such reforms, immortalized not as noble heirs but as grotesque cautionary figures, filled him with despair. He took to long walks through the Paris streets, hood drawn low, seeking solitude in crowded boulevards. Sometimes he stopped at bookshops, buying volumes of poetry he scarcely read, as though the act itself reminded him of the person he had once been. But Paris did not let him forget. Children in the street sang cruel rhymes about the mother bride. At a café one afternoon, he overheard two young men joking about his likeness, one mimicking his bowed head, the other laughing as he played an imaginary violin. He fled before they could see him, shame burning his cheeks. And yet, through all this, the fortune remained secure. The vineyards in Bordeaux still yielded profit. The properties still paid their rents. Madame de la Barre continued to oversee the accounts, her sharp mind ensuring that, scandal or no, the family's wealth did not diminish. For her, this was victory enough. But beneath the surface, cracks widened. Henri's health declined. Philippe plotted his next move. The Chamber of Deputies sharpened its knives, and Paris, insatiable in its hunger for spectacle, demanded ever more of the tale. The de la Barre name, once a symbol of merchant prosperity, was now etched in scandal, and for Henri, each day felt heavier than the last, as though the fortune his mother had saved was nothing less than a weight dragging him down into silence. The summer of 1887 in Paris was heavy, the heat rising from the cobblestones, mingling with the ferment of gossip, politics, and spectacle. By then, the de la Barre case had become more than a scandal. It was a touchstone in debates about morality, law, and the limits of power. The Chamber of Deputies, pressed by Philippe and his allies, convened further hearings on reforming inheritance law. The chamber was packed, the air thick with tobacco smoke and argument. Some deputies thundered that the Republic would collapse if the family, the sacred unit of society, was so debased as to permit marriages of convenience between parent and child. Others countered that the law must remain indifferent to custom, that to legislate on morality was to invite tyranny. Every mention of the Bordeaux case sent murmurs through the chamber. Henri's name was spoken with derision, his mother's with either admiration or contempt, depending on the speaker. Even in absence, they seemed to preside over the debate. The newspapers thrived. One illustrated weekly published a double-page engraving of Madame de la Barre as a queen enthroned, her crown woven of contracts, with Henri as a puppet at her feet. Another paper, more sympathetic, depicted her as a warrior standing against a mob of greedy cousins and corrupt politicians. Both images sold thousands of copies. Henri, meanwhile, wasted away in their Rue de Rivoli lodging. His once delicate health had now become alarming. The stress, the shame, the relentless mockery had eaten into him like a slow disease. He ate little, spoke rarely, and when he played his violin, the notes trembled and broke, more sigh than music. Servants whispered that he looked like a man twice his age. His mother saw his decline, but pressed him to endure. She could not allow weakness. "We have weathered worse," she told him, though in truth they had not. Her voice, firm and commanding, brooked no resistance. Yet in the private hours of night, when she paced the floor while Paris slept, she sometimes pressed a hand against her chest, as though to calm the pounding of her own heart. She was not blind to Henri's suffering. She knew he bore the cost of her decisions, but to her, the alternative, ruin, shame, and surrender, was unthinkable. Philippe, embittered by his defeat in the courts, took his campaign to the public. He spoke in salons, appeared in print, even gave interviews to foreign journalists eager to carry the scandal beyond France. English and German papers soon reported on the Bordeaux affair, painting it as proof of French decadence. In London, a satirical magazine printed a cartoon of Henri and his mother dancing a grotesque waltz while creditors clapped in glee. Madame de la Barre read these clippings without a flicker of emotion, filing them away as evidence of her notoriety. Henri, however, was crushed anew with each article. He longed for obscurity, for the quiet streets of Bordeaux, where at least his shame was confined to familiar eyes. But Paris magnified everything. Every café, every newsstand, every whispered laugh on the street seemed to carry the echo of his name. The government's Commission on Inheritance Law published its findings in July. The report, lengthy and severe, declared that unions of direct descent must henceforth be explicitly forbidden, not only on moral grounds but to prevent the manipulation of estates. The recommendation carried the weight of inevitability. The law, which had once sheltered the de la Barres, was closing behind them. When the Reform Bill was introduced, it was referred to in every speech and article as the de la Barre Law. The name, once a mark of wealth, now became synonymous with infamy. Henri, upon hearing it, collapsed into a chair, his face buried in his hands. "We are cursed," he whispered. His mother, standing behind him, said nothing. She simply placed a hand on his shoulder, not tenderly, but firmly, as though pressing him to bear the weight. Through all this, the fortune itself remained untouched. The vineyards yielded, the rents came due, the accounts flourished. In material terms, Madame de la Barre had triumphed, but in every other respect, the cost mounted. Friends avoided them. Servants feared them. Henri's health waned, his spirit eroded, and the city never ceased to talk. One evening in August, Henri disappeared for several hours. Panic seized the household until he was found, sitting alone on a bench along the Seine, staring into the black water. When asked what he had been doing, he replied simply, "Listening." The words chilled those who heard them. Madame de la Barre tightened her vigilance after that. She forbade him from wandering without an escort, instructed the servants to watch him, and pressed him into routines, music, reading, even brief walks with her, to keep him occupied. Yet she knew she could not command his soul as she commanded estates. His despair deepened, silent but unmistakable. Paris, however, had no patience for sorrow. It demanded entertainment, outrage, spectacle, and the Dalabars, whether they wished it or not, remained its favorite story. By the close of summer, the law reform was poised to pass. The Dalabar fortune was safe, but their legacy was sealed. They would forever be remembered not as guardians of wealth, but as the scandal that forced France to rewrite its laws. For Henri, it was a burden he could scarcely bear. For his mother, it was the price of victory. The autumn of 1887 settled over Paris with grey skies and restless winds. The leaves along the boulevards turned brittle and fell in drifts, and with them came the final stages of the government's deliberations. The Inheritance Reform Bill, already known in every paper and pamphlet as the Dalabar Law, moved through the Chamber of Deputies with momentum that seemed unstoppable. Each debate turned into a rehearsal of the Bordeaux scandal. Deputies rose to speak of the widow bride and her son, of the loophole in the Code Civil that had made such a union possible. Their names were invoked not as people, but as symbols. Henri became the cautionary figure of weakness, a man consumed by his mother's will. Madame de la Barre was depicted either as a villainess or a strategist, depending on the speaker's politics. The public galleries were crowded for every session. Men and women leaned forward to hear the speeches, some jeering, others applauding, while journalists filled their notebooks. The press printed extracts of the debates, ensuring that every home in Paris, and soon in Bordeaux as well, was filled with the echo of the Dalabar name. By October, the reform passed its first vote with overwhelming support. Only a few voices opposed it, warning that legislating morality was dangerous, but theirs were drowned in the tide of outrage. The Senate prepared to consider it next, and there too it seemed inevitable that it would pass. For Henri, the news was unbearable. He had once dreamed of being remembered as a poet, perhaps a composer. Now he knew he would be remembered only as a grotesque footnote in the law. His frail body seemed to fold in upon itself, his eyes hollow, his hands trembling even when at rest. He spent hours by the window, staring at the street below, but when asked what he saw, he replied only, "They laugh." Madame de la Barre, though iron in public, felt the strain in private. She could not fail to notice her son's decline. His cough worsened, his appetite vanished. At night, she sometimes found him awake, sitting in the dark with his violin in his lap, not playing, only holding it as though it were the last remnant of his true self. Yet she refused to yield. To her, the victory had been won, the estate preserved, the fortune intact. If society spat upon her name, so be it. They are fickle, she told Henri. One day they will find another scandal, and we will endure. But Henri did not believe her. He felt the weight of their infamy as a permanent stain. Philippe, still prowling the salons of Paris, took credit for the reform. He boasted that his persistence had forced the hand of the Republic, that his name would be remembered as the champion of family honor. To those who knew of his debts and ambitions, his claims rang hollow, but the public embraced him as a moral victor. For Madame de la Barre, this was the bitterest irony. Her cousin, who had sought to plunder the estate, now basked in the glow of public esteem, while she, who had preserved her fortune, was branded a monster. As winter approached, the Senate confirmed the reform. On November 20th, 1887, the law was passed. Unions between direct descendants were henceforth forbidden, null and void. The text of the new statute was printed in every newspaper, alongside commentary that invariably linked it to the Dalabar scandal. Their names were etched into the law, not as beneficiaries, but as the warning that had provoked change. The morning after the law passed, Henri collapsed. He was found unconscious in his chamber, his violin on the floor beside him. Physicians were summoned, and though he revived, they warned that his health was precarious. His heart was weak, his body worn down by strain and melancholy. He needed rest, quiet, peace, none of which Paris could provide. At last, Madame de la Barre relented. She ordered their return to Bordeaux. The Paris lodging was closed, trunks packed, and the household set in motion for the long journey home. The departure was subdued. No crowds gathered this time. Paris had already turned its attention to newer matters. But in the salons, in the press, in the corridors of power, the Dalabar name lingered like an aftertaste, an emblem of scandal, a reminder of the dangers of loopholes, a tale that would be told for years to come. The train southward rattled through fields and villages, carrying mother and son away from the city that had made them infamous. Henri lay back in his seat, eyes closed, too weak even to read. His mother sat upright, her gaze fixed outward, as though daring the horizon to defy her. When at last the train pulled into Bordeaux, the station was quieter than it had been on their departure. A few curious onlookers gathered, but there was no jeering crowd this time, only a wary silence. The scandal had not been forgotten, but its fire had burned brightest in Paris. Bordeaux, weary of the tale, received them with cool curiosity rather than outrage. The mansion's gates opened to admit them once more. The familiar halls, with their portraits and tapestries, seemed unchanged, yet the air within was heavy with memory. Henri, frail and subdued, went at once to his study, where his books and violin awaited him. Madame de la Barre returned to her office, where the ledgers and accounts still bore testimony to the fortune she had fought so fiercely to preserve. Yet both knew that though the estate stood intact, though the vineyards and properties still yielded wealth, they themselves had been changed forever. Their names were no longer merely those of Bordeaux merchants. They had become symbols of scandal, of defiance, of law reshaped by outrage. In the quiet of the mansion, as autumn winds rattled the shutters, Henri sat at his desk, pen in hand, and began to write. He wrote not of wealth or law, but of sorrow, of shame, of the burden of a name. His words flowed not for publication, but for himself, a frail attempt to set down the weight that pressed upon him. And in her chamber, alone by candlelight, Madame de la Barre stood before the mirror. For the first time in many months, she allowed herself to see the lines etched deep into her face, the grey at her temples, the hard set of her jaw. She had won her war, but victory had carved its mark upon her. The fortune was safe. The law was changed, and the Dalabar name would never again be spoken without scandal. The year 1888 dawned over Bordeaux with pale skies and frosts that clung to the vineyards. The Dalabar mansion, its iron gates closed against the world, stood as a monument to both wealth preserved and honour lost. Within its high walls, silence reigned, broken only by the sound of Henri's violin or the rustle of papers in his mother's office. Henri had grown gaunter still. His collapse in Paris had marked the beginning of a steady decline. Physicians who visited spoke in cautious tones, warning of a failing constitution, of nerves worn thin by strain. They prescribed rest, nourishing food, and solitude. Yet even in solitude, Henri found no peace. His writings, scattered across his desk in untidy heaps, bore witness to his torment. Poems of melancholy, journal entries filled with questions. Why had he yielded? Why had he not resisted? Why had his life become a shadow cast by scandal? Sometimes, when the evening sun slanted across the gardens, he would take his violin and play. The servants listened from a distance, hushed by the mournful beauty of the music. It was not the playing of a man practicing for an audience, but of one pouring sorrow into strings, as though trying to lighten his own heart by giving it voice. Madame de la Barre, for her part, maintained her discipline. Each morning she rose early, attended to the accounts, conferred with estate managers, and sent letters to Paris and London to protect her investments. She never allowed the servants to see weakness. To them she was still the commanding mistress, her voice sharp, her orders precise. Yet at night, when the corridors lay dark, she sometimes lingered in Henry's chamber, watching over him as he slept. Her expression, softened by shadow, betrayed something the world outside would never believe: a mother's grief. Outside the mansion, life in Bordeaux resumed its rhythms. The scandal no longer dominated every conversation. Other matters claimed attention: new elections, shipping ventures, the slow creep of modern industry. Yet the de la Barre name remained tainted. Invitations to society gatherings never came. Neighbors, though outwardly polite, kept their distance. The family was shunned, not with open hostility, but with the colder cruelty of silence. Philippe, though triumphant in the court of public opinion, did not prosper as he had hoped. His debts continued to mount, and while he basked in the glory of having pushed for reform, the practical rewards eluded him. His attempts to build alliances in Paris faltered, and by 1888 he found himself diminished, a man remembered more for his association with scandal than for his own merit. Yet this brought little comfort to the household he had sought to dispossess. Henry's writings grew darker. One entry, discovered later, read, "The law has been written upon my body. My name is their jest, my life their example. If fortune is survival, then I have survived only to be undone." These words, though private, revealed the depth of his despair. Servants whispered of his wanderings in the garden at night, how he would stand by the fountain, gazing at the water as though listening to voices only he could hear. Once, in early spring, he disappeared for several hours, and when found, he was soaked to the skin, standing by the Garonne as though he had nearly stepped into its current. He said nothing, but his eyes told enough. Madame de la Barre tightened her grip on him. She forbade him to walk alone, insisted that a servant remain nearby, and tried to engage him in discussions of the estate. But Henri had no interest in vineyards, rents, or accounts. His soul was bent inward, consumed by the knowledge that he was a symbol of shame, a living emblem of a law rewritten to forbid his own existence. The fortune, paradoxically, flourished. The vineyards yielded excellent harvests, trade with England remained profitable, and new investments in shipping promised further growth. The ledgers glowed with figures that would have pleased Auguste de la Barre himself. Yet the wealth seemed hollow, a fortress with no joy within. By summer, Henry's health worsened. His cough deepened, his weight fell further, and physicians warned of a wasting illness that no treatment could reverse. Madame de la Barre refused to accept their verdict. She ordered every remedy, summoned specialists from Paris, and clung to the belief that his strength would return. But Henri himself seemed resigned. He moved through the days like a ghost, polite, quiet, and weary. One evening in August, as the cicadas sang in the gardens, Henri sat at his desk and wrote a letter. It was not long, only a page, and when he had finished, he folded it neatly and placed it inside his violin case. Then he took up the instrument and played a long, aching melody that carried through the house, drawing servants to the corridor outside his chamber. They listened, hushed, as the music rose and fell, a lament as fragile as breath. When at last the final note faded, silence followed, so deep that even the cicadas seemed to pause. That night, Henri did not rise again from his bed. By morning, he was gone. The house was plunged into grief. The servants wept, the physician bowed his head, and Madame de la Barre shut herself in her chamber, unseen for days. The letter in the violin case was found later. It contained no accusations, no bitterness, only a single line: "Forgive me, for I was not made to bear the weight." Henri was buried in the family vault beside his father. The funeral was attended by few. Neighbors came out of duty, some out of curiosity, but many stayed away. The scandal clung even to his death. Madame de la Barre stood at the graveside, her black veil hiding her face. She did not weep openly. Her bearing was as severe as ever, yet those who stood near swore her hands trembled as she held the rosary. The fortune was hers now alone, but the price had been exacted. The winter of 1888 pressed heavily upon Bordeaux. The vineyards lay bare, their twisted vines black against the frost, and within the mansion of the de la Barres, silence deepened after Henri's burial. The corridors seemed emptier, the rooms colder, though fires blazed in every hearth. Servants moved about softly, as though the house itself had become a tomb. Madame de la Barre resumed her routines with iron will. She attended to ledgers, corresponded with merchants, and gave instructions with her accustomed severity. Outwardly she appeared unshaken, but in truth the death of her son hollowed her. The silence in the evenings, when once his violin had filled the air, pressed upon her like a weight. The sight of his empty study, with the violin case resting on the desk, was a wound she could not look upon for long. Rumours spread quickly through Bordeaux. Some whispered that Henri had taken his own life, though no proof supported it. Others said he had wasted away from sorrow. In either case, the city interpreted his death as the tragic conclusion of a scandal too grave for any man to endure. The tale of the mother who married her son now acquired a final act: a son buried in his youth, a mother left alone with her fortune. The press, hungry for sensation, revived the story with new fervour. Parisian papers printed lengthy retrospectives, recounting every stage of the affair, from the first whispers in Bordeaux to the debates in the chamber, from the reform of the law to the son's untimely death. One journal declared, "The fortune is preserved, but the price was the heir himself." Thus, Providence exacts balance. Foreign newspapers echoed the sentiment. In London, an editorial remarked that wealth without honour had brought only ruin. In Berlin, a satirical sketch showed Madame de la Barre clutching sacks of gold while death led Henri away by the hand. Her name, once respected in mercantile circles, became a byword for ruthless ambition. Philippe, ever opportunistic, sought to capitalize even on Henri's passing. He spread word in salons that the de la Barre fortune was cursed, that no good could come of estates preserved by such means. Yet he gained nothing by it. The law was settled, the estate secure, and though he revelled in society's condemnation of his cousin, his own position remained precarious. His debts consumed him, and the glory he had sought through moral posturing faded. For Madame de la Barre, life narrowed to the walls of her estate. She received no visitors, save for men of business. Invitations ceased, though she would not have accepted them. She moved between her office, the chapel, and Henry's chamber, where she sometimes lingered in silence. Servants spoke of hearing her whisper prayers in the night, prayers not for herself, but for the soul of her son. The vineyards yielded well in those years. The estate grew richer, the accounts swelled, and her position as a landowner remained unassailable. Yet she knew, as did all of Bordeaux, that the fortune had become inseparable from the scandal. The name de la Barre no longer stood for success, but for a tale retold in whispers, of ambition, of defiance, of a mother who would bind her son to save her wealth, and of a young man crushed beneath the weight of a legacy he could not bear. By the early 1890s, the scandal had passed into legend. New generations, who had not witnessed the trial, knew the story only through articles, caricatures, and gossip, yet the outlines never faded. The phrase, a de la Barre marriage, entered local speech as a mocking shorthand for unnatural unions contrived for profit. The law reform stood firm, cited in legal texts with a note of its origin. Henry's name, though seldom spoken with respect, lived on as the example that had forced France to redraw its code. Madame de la Barre lived on for many years, her health steady, her will unbroken. She guarded the estate with the same vigilance as before, but she withdrew ever further from society. In her final decades, she became a figure half feared, half pitied, the mistress of great wealth, alone in her mansion, haunted by a past that could never be untold. When at last she died, in the opening years of the new century, the city marked her passing with curiosity rather than grief. The newspapers recounted her life with cold precision. Her marriage, her widowhood, the scandal, the trial, the law, the death of her son. Few spoke of her virtues. Many recalled her iron will. Her fortune, still vast, passed into the hands of distant relatives. The vineyards, the properties, the accounts endured. But the name de la Barre, once synonymous with prosperity, remained forever scarred. Thus the story closed, not with ruin of estates, but with ruin of legacy. The wealth survived, but honour did not. And in France's laws, in Bordeaux's memory, and in the whispers of Europe's salons, the tale endured, of the mother who married her son to save the fortune, and in so doing lost him. They thought death would end the whispers, but the story lives on. If you want to uncover more Obsidian fragments of the past, don't forget to subscribe to Eternal Obsidian.